General Zyrol of the Drask Imperium had fought countless wars. He had conquered worlds, crushed rebellions, and outmaneuvered some of the greatest tactical minds in the galaxy. And yet, nothing in his centuries of warfare had prepared him for the horrifying reality of human resilience. The day he watched one human shrug off death itself was the day he realized they had made a mistake. The Drask invasion of Rexal 7 had been calculated down to the last strategic detail. The human defensive lines were stretched thin. The Terran forces were outnumbered 10-1. The Drask warriors, towering reptilian apex predators, had the superior firepower. Victory was supposed to be inevitable, and for the first few hours, it was. Then, something went wrong. The humans stopped dying, or rather, they kept fighting even when they should already be dead. Sergeant Dane Carter of the Terran 22nd Infantry Division had seen worse days. Sure, he had just been hit with a plasma blast at point-blank range. His left arm wasn't working properly. He was pretty sure 2 of his ribs were broken, and he was running low on ammo. But none of that really mattered right now. What mattered was that his squad was pinned down, and if they didn't push forward, they'd be wiped out. So, Carter did what any human would do. He kept moving. General Zyrol watched from the Drask command center, his claws tapping against the metal surface of his chair. On the holo display, he saw the moment a direct plasma shot struck the human. Zyrol leaned forward, waiting for the Terran to collapse. Instead, the human got back up. Zyrol's frills twitched. What? His officers stared at the screen in silence. The human's voice crackled over an open comm channel. Relax, it's just a scratch. Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. General Zyrol's claws tightened. He just took a plasma shot to the chest and called it a scratch? His officers said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Sergeant Dane Carter should have been dead. At least, that's what the Drask warriors expected when they saw the plasma bolt hit him square in the chest. The energy blast had burned through his armor, sending him crashing into the dirt. Any other species would have stayed down, but not this human, not Carter. He was already standing back up, and when his comlink crackled with the worried voices of his squadmates, his only response was, "Relax, it's just a scratch." The Drask stared in stunned silence, because that was not a scratch. That was a mortal wound. And yet, the human was still moving, still fighting, still winning. General Zyrol had seen enough. He wasn't stupid. This wasn't normal. No soldier, no species, should have been able to keep fighting through that kind of injury. That meant one of 2 things. The humans had some kind of advanced cybernetic augmentation. They were hiding a biological advantage the Drask had never accounted for. Either way, he needed answers. Zyrol turned sharply toward his lead field commander. "Send in a capture team." The officer hesitated. "Sir, wouldn't it be easier to—" "I want him alive." There was a brief pause. Then, a squad of Drask hunters, specialized in subduing and capturing high-value targets, were dispatched. Carter was tired. His left arm was useless. His breathing was getting heavier, and he was pretty sure his ribs were cracked. But there was a job to do. His squad was still pinned down, and if they didn't push forward, they'd be overrun. So, Carter did what any stubborn, battle-hardened Terran would do. He kept moving. He spotted a fallen Drask soldier, ripped the plasma rifle from its hands, and charged straight at the enemy. His squadmates watched in disbelief. "Carter, what the hell are you doing?" Carter grinned, despite the blood trickling down his face. "Winning." The Drask hunters moved quickly. Carter barely had time to react before he heard the hiss of compressed air, the sound of a reinforced electronet firing toward him. He spun, but the net caught his legs, sending a shock through his body. For a moment, the Drask team thought they had him. Then Carter stood back up, with the electronet still wrapped around him. The Drask commander took a step back. "That's not possible." Carter sighed. "Really? You guys again?" Then, with pure brute force, he ripped the net apart. The Drask stopped moving. They had never seen anything like this. The human shouldn't be able to walk. And yet, here he was, standing, smirking, and looking mildly annoyed. Back in the Drask command center, General Zyrol stared at the live footage. A human had just broken out of an electronet, not struggled, not fought against it, not waited for someone to free him. He had simply decided that it wasn't going to work. Zyrol felt a slow, creeping fear settle in his chest. What are we fighting? No one had an answer. The Drask Imperium had fought dozens of species. They had conquered entire star systems, faced warriors who could breathe fire, manipulate gravity, and regenerate limbs. But nothing prepared them for humans. Because humans didn't break. And now, the Drask needed to understand why. Deep inside the Drask High Command Research Facility, a team of top xenobiologists and military strategists were gathered. They had one objective: figure out why humans refused to die. The lead scientist, Dr. Vreshok, activated a holographic display showing Sergeant Dane Carter's biomedical readings from the battlefield. The data was unbelievable. Plasma burn across the chest, still standing. Fractured arm, continued combat. Internal bleeding, showed no signs of fatigue. Severe dehydration, did not stop moving. Vreshok adjusted his lenses and turned to the assembled officers. There are several anomalies in human biology that allow for this kind of behavior. General Zyrol, watching from the command deck, leaned forward. Explain. Vreshok inhaled sharply. The first problem, he said, tapping a data panel, is pain. A murmur spread through the room. What about it? Zyrol asked. Vreshok clicked to the next slide, a detailed diagram of human nervous systems. In most species, pain is an immediate shutdown response. It prevents further damage by forcing the body into a defensive state. He tapped the human model. But in humans, pain is optional. Zyrol's claws tightened on his chair. The scientist sighed. Humans have a unique adrenaline response. It allows them to ignore injuries if their brain decides it's not a priority. He zoomed in on a chart labeled Pain Threshold Variability, Human Subjects. Their pain response is inconsistent. Some humans feel pain more acutely than others. Some can ignore it entirely. And some, he hesitated. Some humans deliberately train themselves to push past pain as a matter of discipline. Zyrol's eyes narrowed. You mean they can override their own pain? The scientist nodded slowly. In some cases, yes. Silence filled the room. Then, one of the military strategists exhaled in disbelief. That's insane. Vreshok wasn't finished. It gets worse. The next slide appeared. It showed a list of common human phrases regarding pain. Zyrol tilted his head. What is this? Vreshok cleared his throat. These are direct quotes from injured human soldiers. He gestured toward the screen. It's just a scratch. I've had worse. Walk it off. I'll sleep when I'm dead. Pain is just weakness leaving the body. The Drask officers stared at the list. Finally, one of them muttered, What kind of species treats injury as an inconvenience? Vreshok clicked to the final medical log. The battlefield report on Sergeant Carter. His injuries were listed in full detail. 2 broken ribs, 1 fractured arm, severe dehydration, minor organ damage, and his treatment received during battle. Water. General Zyrol sat in silence, processing the data. His entire military doctrine was based on breaking enemy morale through overwhelming force. But humans, they didn't break. They just kept coming. Finally, Zyrol spoke. This war, he said slowly, is unwinnable. The room fell silent. Vreshok nodded grimly. If we keep fighting, he said, we may win battles, but we will never make them stop fighting. Zyrol exhaled. Then, for the first time in Drask history, he made a choice no Drask general had ever made before. Send a message to the humans, he ordered. Request a ceasefire. The Drask Imperium had never surrendered a war. In their history of conquest, they had either crushed their enemies or fought to the last warrior. But this time was different. This time, they had encountered humans. And now, General Zyrol was doing something unthinkable. He was asking for peace. The transmission was sent through encrypted military channels. It was not a formal surrender, not an admission of defeat. But the message was clear. The Drask Imperium has no further interest in conflict with the United Terran Forces. A ceasefire is requested. No additional military actions will be taken. The humans responded within the hour. They accepted. No negotiations, no demands, no revenge. Just a simple agreement. The war was over. Publicly, the Drask Imperium claimed that the war had become strategically unviable. They told their citizens, logistics and resources required a shift in military focus. Terran space was not worth continued conflict. The Imperium has achieved its objectives and will now consolidate its power. But behind closed doors, the truth was much simpler. They could not win, because they could not outlast the humans. And if they kept fighting, they would lose everything. The galactic community took notice. The Drask Imperium had never backed down from a war, and yet they had now abandoned a military campaign after a single major engagement with the Terrans. Other species began asking questions. How had the humans forced the Drask to retreat? What happened on Vrexal 7 that changed everything? Why did the Drask seem unwilling to discuss the war? And most importantly, were humans even possible to defeat? When Sergeant Dane Carter finally heard about the Drask ceasefire, he was sitting in a field hospital, finally letting the medics work on him. A Terran war correspondent approached him, datapad in hand. "Sergeant, do you have any comments about the Drask retreat?" Carter, his ribs still wrapped in bandages, shrugged. "They put up a good fight." The reporter blinked. "They had to end the war because of you." Carter took a sip of his water. "Well, I can't take all the credit." The medic next to him scoffed. "You fought through 2 broken ribs, a fractured arm, and a plasma burn." She gestured at his bandages. "Your body should have shut down from the pain." Carter grinned. "Could have been worse." The alien medics in the room looked visibly disturbed. The war may have ended, but the legend of human pain tolerance had only just begun. The Drask Imperium never fought humans again. Not because of treaties, not because of diplomacy, not because of political maneuvering, but because they had seen the truth. Humans did not break. Humans did not surrender. And when a Terran soldier took a wound that should have killed them and called it just a scratch, it was already too late. The ceasefire with the Terrans marked the first time in Drask history that they had abandoned a conflict. Publicly, they claimed logistics and resource allocation required a shift in military focus. Privately, the warlords never spoke of Vrexal 7. Among Drask High Command, one unspoken rule emerged. Do not engage humans in prolonged combat. Do not assume injuries slow them down. Do not believe a wounded human is out of the fight. Because they weren't. And by the time you realized it, they'd already won. When news of the Drask withdrawal reached the Galactic Council, other species took notice. The Drask were known for waging brutal wars of attrition. They fought until the enemy was either crushed or extinct. But now, they had fled from a single engagement. The questions began immediately. What had the humans done to force them back? What were the real casualties of the war? Why did the Drask refuse to discuss it? And more importantly, had humanity just become untouchable? Months later, Sergeant Dane Carter was officially recognized as one of the key figures in the Battle of Vrexal 7. His actions were reviewed by Terran military officials, journalists, and political leaders. When asked if he was proud of his role in forcing the Drask to retreat, his answer was simple. I was just doing my job." The reporter interviewing him stared. "You single-handedly kept an entire squad alive and caused an empire to retreat." Carter shrugged. "I mean, sure, but—" The medic sitting nearby cut him off. "This man fought through 2 broken ribs, a fractured arm, and a plasma burn. and still refused to let the battle stop. Carter took a sip of water. Could have been worse. The alien medics in the room went pale, and that was the moment the galaxy finally understood. Humans weren't just tough, they were terrifying. The Drask Imperium never again waged war against humanity, and whenever a new species encountered humans in battle, they always whispered one question: how much can they take before they stop fighting? The answer: no one knew. Because no one had ever seen it happen. Because when a human looks at a mortal wound and says, "It's just a scratch," they mean it.